All right, I think I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Flagler College, at least virtually. I am Art Vanden Houten. I'm an associate professor of political science at Flagler. I wish I could tell you I was sitting in the dining hall. That's the back room behind me. I'm actually sitting in my home office, and like most of you, I've been trying to figure out a variety of ways to function during the pandemic in these unprecedented times. But when I was asked if I would participate in this, I jumped at the opportunity. And I'm excited to have the chance to spend a little time with you. I think the title of my talk has been appropriately lectured, A Century of Genocide, but I want to emphasize really two things at the very beginning. The first point is that this is not the way I normally teach. If you were to come to Flagler, you would not find many faculty who are living in a world of PowerPoint and lecturing, to students. My classes are discussion intensive, and that starts with first semester, first year students on their very first day, right up until senior seminar when students are getting ready to graduate, right? So the classroom is a dynamic and engaged place designed for all of us to work together to explore questions and issues. And again, it's not a place where I'm simply talking to a room full of dozens of students, right? So it's hard, of course, to replicate that today, but I do want to make two important points. One is that anytime during the course of my comments, if you have a question, please feel free to kind of, raise your hand or jump in on the chat and raise that question, and I'll be happy to kind of engage it and for us to, have a conversation. I certainly don't have the last word on any of the issues that we're talking about, and having a kind of engaged discussion and debate among a variety of people who are interested is the way in which we move forward in our learning and understanding. Just as importantly in that, at the end, the final bit of material I want to talk about, which will probably be a decent chunk of our time together, in fact, is a discussion and relies upon you to raise questions. Again, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask the question so that we can all hear it, or you can simply raise it in the chat room. So that's kind of on my last slide. As I get started here, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I'm going to do this with some skill. I don't know that I will, but there we go. You see, talk today is A Century of Genocide, Mass Murder and Its Causes in the 20th Century, and there's my title. You'll also see references to me on campus as the Dean of Academic Life, because I also have an administrative role. And I've been in that position for about 2 years, but this is my 23rd year at Flagler. So I have been here for a really long time, and it has been one of the great privileges of my life to be able to teach political science at Flagler and to be able to work with students. And when the job offer came and I grabbed it, immediately jumped into the community and just found it to be an incredibly stimulating and exhilarating place. And I hope that that's the experience that all of you have. So I opened by saying, this is not what you would see me do, namely a PowerPoint presentation and a lot of talking at you. But I have my second slide, which I hope sort of can happen here. Let's see. Yeah. So it's titled Classes at Flagler. Back in 2014, I was team teaching a class on genocide with my friend and colleague, John Young, and C-SPAN reached out to us, or reached out to me because I had done some work with them before, and said, hey, could we, tape a class of yours that we could show on C-SPAN? And I said, sure, that would be good, but I'm doing a class on genocide right now. And they said, oh, that's perfect. That's what we're interested in. So I have the link. If you just simply search C-SPAN, Rwandan genocide, Flagler, it'll come up. And this is a video. It's about 2 hours, so it's long. It was a senior seminar that Professor Young and I were teaching together. And that would give you a real flavor for what a Flagler College classroom would be like. That is Professor Young and I think there's maybe 14 students. We're sitting around the table and we are having a discussion about the Rwandan genocide and the role of the United States as it contemplated intervening to stop that genocide, and then ultimately decided that it would not do that, right? So you can go and you can kind of watch that. As I said, it's about 2 hours long, and by no means is anybody expected to be all in for it, but it does give you a good flavor for what a kind of dynamic Flagler College classroom would look like. The other thing I would just tell you quickly is to set that room up that we were in, they made it unbelievably cold. So it's probably about 60 degrees in that room while the cameras are on us, and you'll see people are kind of chilly and cold, but that's sort of a minor point. So if you have any interest, you can see that and go, watch it at your leisure if this is something you have an interest in, or if you think yourself I'd like to see a little bit more about what a small Flagler College classroom would look like. So with that, let's turn to the material for our discussion, right, and for our conversation. So what I have on these slides today that you'll see are things, and I have, again, as I said at the beginning, I've never taught a class with PowerPoint, so this is my first run into this. But the things I've put on the slide for us to look at today are things that either I would give as a physical handout to students while they're sitting in class, or literally things that I would write up on the board right behind me, in the classroom, and then for us to talk about. So what I wanted to do today was really three things. First was just talk very briefly about how the world community has defined genocide, right, since the 1940s, right after World War II, and that's not a kind of random or coincidental date, right? Rather, World War II sits in the forefront of people's minds as they're talking about this. And then secondly, talk a little bit about why scholars think this 20th century has been filled with genocidal activity, right? Why was it such a murderous period? And then third, have a little bit of a conversation, if we can do that, if I can facilitate it, about some questions and issues that genocide raises. So I'll read this, so I'm not going to read everything on our slides today at all. So first, right, when we look at what's known as the crime of genocide, quite appropriately, this is from the United Nations Convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. I've shortened it for the purposes of the slide. We quickly see two features, right? The first feature is that there has to be some kind of intent. For a state or a leader to be accused of the crime of genocide, it's got to be something they're intending, something that they're trying to do, right? So what we see, again, I'll read it, though you can read it easily, obviously. Genocide means any of the following acts, there on the second slide, committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, right? So when we think of the tremendous genocides, I don't mean tremendous in any positive way, of the 20th century, we think of states, the Nazis perhaps being kind of the most evil and most readily memorable example, having a policy that is aimed at destroying, right, entirely large groups of people. So the first thing we think about when we think about genocide is, okay, someone's got an intention to do something. It doesn't mean that they successfully do it, but rather it means that they intend to do it. It's something they aspire to do. If we want to use really sort of distressing language, something that they hope to do, right? So the acts come here on the second page, but I'll go back, the first one, right? You see requisite intent means mens rea. That's the kind of intent that you have in your mind, right? It's technically a term from the criminal justice system. And then we see this, the actus reus, right? This is all Latin, right, from codified international law. And here are the prohibited acts, right? Now, if you look at this list of acts that are prohibited, things that if a government has done them, say the Nazis, say the Rwandan government in 1994, and you can connect it to intent, you can say now these people are guilty of the crime of genocide, right? Again, I'm not going to kind of read all five of these. You can spend a moment looking at them. But all of them obviously make a certain amount of sense, okay? It's worth noting that the way the UN Convention defines genocide, there is no expectation that the international community will act after the event. In fact, the way it's written, it essentially assumes states, governments like the United States or Canada or England or Germany or France can intervene during the genocide, right? They can see two things. Number one is intent. God, it sure looks like this government, the Rwandan government, let's say again in 1994, made up of the Hutu majority, Hutu, is trying to annihilate, destroy the Tutsi minority because they're doing these kinds of things, right? that are ultimately prohibited. So what we want to see is, again, the definition of genocide has these two elements to it. It's got intention, and then it's got action. And again, the list seems to strike us as, kind of common sense and straightforward, right? You might ask questions about specific pieces of it, but by and large, you'd say to yourself, okay, this seems to, make sense and fit a kind of common sense definition, right? Okay. We look at the definition itself. What are some what I call like striking features? There is in the 1940s a man by the name of Raphael Lemkin, right? You can see a picture of Lemkin here. A Polish Jew, a scholar in Poland, right? Who the Nazis have invaded Poland 4 years earlier, 1939, and they are now occupying it. And Lemkin looks and thinks to himself, okay, something is happening that the Nazis are doing that no other government has ever done in history or has ever recently done, right? And Lemkin invents a word, and the word he invents is genocide, right? He takes the Greek word for people and the Latin suffix "cide" for murder, and he talks about a crime that has not yet ever been named. Lemkin knows it's been perpetrated before. He knows that there have been genocides in the past. But he also says this is something new and demands recognition, right? So the book he writes is a book called Axis Rule in Europe, right? It's a big book, not surprisingly, because there's a lot of Axis violence, the Axis powers, right, of the Nazis and the Italians, right? But he invents this word. And in international law and in international politics, it is surely a revolutionary moment. We should note that the United Nations, when it takes up this convention, we can think of it loosely as a treaty. They take Lemkin's word. They don't quite take his definition, okay? What he had done was emphasized a crime also of like cultural violence, where what the aggressors, again, let's think of the Nazis because that example is typically so familiar to us, are trying to do not just to destroy the people, but also to destroy their culture, to kind of wipe their memory out from human history and to remove permanently the legacy, the influence of a culture, the memory of a culture, right? So Lemkin sees that as a critical part of the crime. And that surely, makes a certain amount of sense, right? We should, I think, see Lemkin as a heroic figure, right? He doesn't immediately get embraced by people. People don't immediately see him as doing something new and revolutionary, but he works really tirelessly during World War II and at the end to make people think about the world differently. And he leaves an enduring legacy. And that's an honorable thing, for sure. A couple other quick points, right? The first is you can see the shadow of World War II here really clearly. You can see people thinking of the crimes of the Nazis against the Jews, against the Roma, sometimes informally referred to as gypsies, against other people in Eastern Europe. You can see people thinking about what the Japanese did to the Chinese during their horrific occupation of China. You see kind of the victors with the mind, in their mind, of World War II and what happened there. Obvious point, right? This emphasizes intention and action, intent and acts. And that raises some questions about potential limits. So I'll come to that in the next slide as to how valuable, right, this definition is. But these are just things at this stage that we want to note. We should also emphasize, just a quick sidebar about the United States. The United States does not ratify the treaty until 1988, right? We are an original signatory, right, in 1948, it's December 11th, 1948. But the United States Senate doesn't get around to ratifying the treaty and giving it the force of law in the United States for another 40 years. It's pretty extraordinary, ultimately, right? But the United States waits to ratify, and the Senate does not take action. And there's reasons for that, and you can kind of do some of that research and find out, what's driving U.S. politics at that point. But anyway, just kind of worth noting. So, maybe questions at this point? Anything they would want to ask or raise, or let's see if I can see if people are raising their hands in any way, shape, or form. Okay. Yeah, certainly if you've got questions, feel free to kind of, jump in and put them up there. So, okay. So, potential limitations to the definition. And by the way, there's scholars who spend enormous amounts of time and energy arguing over the definition, right, of the word of genocide. Not arguing over what the UN passed, but rather arguing whether that, definition is an adequate one. And that's a lot of interesting scholarly research. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it today, but it's sort of out there, right? You typically get essentially two broad criticisms, right? And I'll mention the last one on my bullet point next to this little chart, right? Where it seems to exclude political persecution. If you go back, right, to the first slide, see if I can kind of get us there, right? You go back to the first slide, it talks about national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups. It doesn't talk about targeting political opposition, right? People who might actually come from the same nation, religious group, whatever, but are opposed to something the government is doing. If you look at this chart, actually, right, and I'll tell you where this comes from in a moment, you actually can see, right, this chart tries to capture kind of murder by states, murder by governments, right, of people under their authority at different times, and sort of shows, right, here's the apex of this, and then shows kind of events in recent memory as well. A number of these, I'm going to point to three of them rather. One is this first one, or the second one, Soviet collectivization. And then over here, China's land reform and Chinese collectivization. Both of these are bloody, violent acts perpetrated by governments that literally kill tens of millions of people, right? It doesn't reach the height of all this murder that we see during World War II, but that's an extraordinary set of circumstances. These other crimes, people are not really, or not totally, in some cases not even remotely, targeted for their national, ethnic, religious background or identity, but they're actually targeted for political purposes, right? It is their political opposition to government policy that gets the government to say, we're coming after you, and you're ultimately going to be persecuted. So these crimes, the Soviet Great Terror fits as well, don't really fit under the definition, right? They don't really fit under the United Nations definition. And this has always raised a question with people about the adequacy of it. If you look over here, down on this end, you'll see something also referred to as the Cambodian genocide, right? It's a country right near Vietnam, where the United States, right, fought a war from the 1950s until the 1970s. Cambodia is a neighboring country. The United States bombed Cambodia in part during that war, although they were technically an ally of ours, right? A genocide there from 1975 until 1979 kills 1.5 million to 2 million people. It's a big, big number, obviously, right? It's a horrific number. Compared to some other genocides, it's a smaller number, but it's actually 25% of the population. It's a quarter of the population, right? It's an extraordinary, murderous period in this small, tragic country's, burdensome history. Most of the people targeted there are targeted for political reasons. They're not targeted for ethnic, religious, national kinds of reasons. Okay. And then the last point I just want to note is this question about the issue of intent, right? Can you evade the intent standard? There's long been a question about, can a government essentially dodge responsibility by saying this is not something that we intended. The deaths of large numbers of people is not something we intended. We were trying to fight a war. We were trying to defend ourselves, and therefore it's not genocide. And I'll hit a couple of examples that this is relevant for, right, in a moment. Okay. Again, if you have questions, just don't hesitate to kind of pop them in there. So I say, right, the 20th century is this bloody period. Well, it's hardly the first, right? Good way to think about this with a certain amount of rhetorical force is genocide exists before the word is invented, right? Governments are killing entire peoples before anybody thinks that that's a specific crime. People may think it's wrong, but no one's thinking of it as a specific and distinct crime. In fact, during the Nazi crimes, before the word genocide is invented, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, we'll say like the Nazis are guilty of a crime that has no name, right? Just a couple of quick examples. Athenians and Romans, right? Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, both of them deliberately execute policies that annihilate, subject populations, people under them. The Athenians kill a group of people called the Melians, Melians, and the Romans, the Carthaginians, right? From the Hebrew scriptures, right, the Bible more broadly, we get, or what Christians might refer to as the Old Testament, we get a number of examples, two specifically come out. One is from 1 Samuel, and the second is from Numbers chapter 31. It's worth noting in both these cases, the scripture has God commanding the people of Israel to annihilate entirely some other peoples, right? So the picture here is a picture from what a group of people known as the Amalekites, and that's from 1 Samuel, where God says, kill every last one of them, destroy every single last one of them. And this is an Amalekite leader who's on his knees before Saul, right? The king who precedes David. And actually Saul will spare the leaders' lives, and that will be the reason why he's dumped as the leader by God or abandoned by the leader by God and replaced with David. So it does look like there's a question. So let me see if I can get this. Yeah. Good, right? So this is a question about, right, good. Right, Dasha asked a good question. How did we sort of think about the crimes that were committed, right? The Armenian genocide, Soviet collectivism, before, right, genocide, before the word was invented. And, I think in the Armenian case, when I grew up, right, I had family members who had been kids in the 1920s and 1930s, and the Armenian genocide takes place in 1914, 1915, 1916. And these people would say, I can remember my parents telling me, the Armenians are starving at the hands of the Turks, right? Make sure you eat all the food on your plate. So these were seen as mass atrocities. These were seen as brutal oppression. But again, there wasn't a distinctive word, right, that would be used. And international law didn't really cover these things, or didn't cover them in the way we think of now, where the United Nations is a kind of world body that now points and says, the crime of genocide is now underway. So this is a great question. Okay. Just one last one on the Native Americans, right? That one I think is a significant one because first, large numbers of people die, right? It's also a hotly debated genocide in the sense people ask the question, is this truly an act of genocide? And what's often claimed to be missing, but not everybody agree with this, but it's often claimed that what's missing is intent, right? Europeans did not come here with the intent of annihilating tens of millions of indigenous peoples. It happened through disease, conquest, and dislocation, but it was not genocide. There are, of course, very, very, very passionate voices opposed to that. They say, wait, this is actually the crime of genocide because the numbers are so high, because the policies are so merciless. And I think it's worth pausing here just for a moment. This is something we frequently see in genocide scholarship, is we see debate over terms, right? And debate over specific historical events and should or should they not be classified as genocide. Now, let me quickly say, no one responsibly, right, who says, well, look, the annihilation of the Native Americans is not an act of genocide, is not saying it didn't happen. They're not saying that, right? They're saying it doesn't fall under some definition, right, that we're using. Okay. So let's now turn to the 20th century. I'm going to go through 5 reasons, and I'm going to go through them very, very quickly, okay? First of all, one thing that we see happens, I've got 2 maps here. I realize both might be hard to read, so bear with me just for a minute, is we see at the end of the 19th century, a whole series of European great powers fall apart, right? So if you look at the map on the right, and I probably should have had the map flipped, but sorry. You'll look here, you can see here, this is the Russian Empire, right? It's over this way. And then right here in this pinkish color is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the German state, right? This is World War I, not World War II, so the Nazis are not in charge here. All 3 of these governments will collapse during World War I, right? They'll be defeated, they'll surrender, they'll fall apart. And what emerges is a whole series of new countries in their space. So you get the Soviet Union, right? You get the small Baltic states. I don't mean small in any derogatory way. You'll get Poland, you'll get Belarusia, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. You can see kind of all these countries that emerge here. Oops. Those countries are all unstable, and partly because they're new. One of the things that we see, it's not the only thing, but one of the things we see is when new governments arise and there's uncertainty about who governs the territory, we often see a lot of violence in that space. And we often see a lot of violence directed at like minority populations. Okay. Second reason, we see in the 20th century the emergence of fierce forms of nationalism, right? And fierce is like almost being polite about it. In fact, they're like murderous forms of nationalism. Claims that there are a distinctive people who are better than the rest of the world and who are threatened ultimately by some other kind of group of people. That doesn't get invented in the 20th century. That predates the 20th century. But the 20th century does two things that are unique, that amplify the violence. In some cases, religion and nationalism get married together. We see that over here in the Armenian genocide. Turkey, a country that emerges, right, when the Ottoman Empire falls apart in World War I, another thing I could have pointed to on the previous map, directs its murderous intent toward the Christian Armenians, not just the Christian, or not just the Armenians, by the way, there's other smaller Christian populations that they also target. And they develop this ideology that emphasizes religion and nationalism, Turkish identity and Islam. Though, interestingly enough, many Islamic leaders are kind of like resisting this at the time. But it's the marriage of those two things that becomes so murderous. And then over here, you see a classroom in Nazi Germany trying to offer a scientific justification for the superiority of the Aryan race, for the superiority of the German people. So we see what happens is these two ideas like intersect, right? On the one hand, science and nationalism, and the other hand, religion and nationalism. And they seem to like justify the most violent, radical forms of national identity. Third, the 20th century is filled with a lot of social turmoil, political turmoil, economic turmoil. We often associate three really crucial developments, right, with this. One is the emergence of capitalism, right, an economic system familiar to all of us, right, emerges long before the 20th century, but by the 20th century, it is this kind of dominant, right, economic system around the world. Democracy, a political system, right, that emphasizes voting and rights and all those things that are, or voting in elections, those things that are kind of familiar to us. And then third, liberalism. By the way, liberalism, you should see, right, is closely connected to these two, but it is also something separate. It would emphasize the rights of the individual. It would emphasize the rule of law. It would emphasize the power of the courts, right? All these things are pieces of this. These three things sort of emerge and they begin to become dominant in many parts of the world. And that creates an incredible amount of turmoil, right? As old ways of life are swept aside, disrupted, and the turmoil creates a great deal of uncertainty for people. Historically, we think in political science, at least, of two challenges emerging, two worldviews that say, wait, capitalism, democracy, and liberalism, they're bankrupt. They're not the way to live. They're false ideologies. The way to live is under fascism, which you can see here to the left, or communism, which you can see here to the right, okay? Those get seen as like the two great ideological challenges to this trinity of capitalism, democracy, and liberalism. So, whoops, let me see. Go back, sorry. Let's see, you got another question? All right, should I open it? Oh, I can't. All right, sorry. By the way, on the left, right, this is actually the memorial to the Holocaust in Romania. Romania during World War II was ruled, and before World War II was ruled by a radical fascist government associated with the Nazis. And the Romanians persecuted Romanian Jews horrifically, killing hundreds of thousands of them in a very short period of time. And it was not until the 21st century, 2009, I think, that this memorial opened up as a way to try to memorialize the crimes Romanians committed against their own citizens the Jewish population to the tune of probably 300,000, and then an indigenous population of Roma, again, people sometimes refer to as gypsies, right? The Roma is the more appropriate term, to the tune of about 200,000 of them. This was not Nazis pointing guns at Romanians. This was the Romanian government adopting a policy that the Nazis themselves were urging, but doing it, the only word really you can say is enthusiastically, right? And the stories from the Romanian part of the Holocaust are chilling in the extreme. Over here we see communism. This picture is a picture of the Soviet Union expelling citizens from the southern part of Russia, known sometimes as the Caucasus region, right? There's a couple of countries down there like Georgia. These people are Chechens and Ishgars, and they're kicked out of their countries, marched by the hundreds of thousands far to the east, right? This picture's taken right at the end of World War II. So that's kind of our third, right, key force, okay? You get these violent ideologies that emerge to resist the emergence of capitalism, democracy, and liberalism. Let's see, I guess, the next one. 4, something about rapid technological change. When societies change quickly technologically, we often see fierce resistance to this. This is a picture from the Nazi era, and the picture actually is from Leni Riefenstahl, German film director who worked closely with the Nazis. She lived to be over 100 and spent most of her life denying that she'd worked closely with the Nazis, but that was just a lie. But Riefenstahl, right, produces this film that most scholars of cinema, film history, think is kind of a revolutionary moment for the propaganda of evil, but still, technically it's sophisticated. And what I think is so interesting about this is it brings to mind the revolution that we see in cinema, film, visual images. This is often so hard for us in the 21st century to fathom, but it's really just been about 100 years where people would never have seen a moving picture of anything. I mean, literally, they would not have seen a moving picture of anything. And suddenly film is out there, and radio is there, and there are all these kinds of technological innovations, right, that become so significant. And Riefenstahl's film is really designed to do a lot of things, but one is it sort of elevates Hitler above the crowd, right? And there's pictures there that show him above the crowd. But then you just see also this mass of humanity that she has worked with the Nazi leaders to kind of orchestrate in a way that shows the movement to be one that is embraced by many, many people. I didn't note on this list, but I probably should have. There is another thing that we see that's a really interesting but also troubling precursor to genocide, right? And that is society seems to be more vulnerable to this when the status of women changes radically, typically where we see more progressive improvement policies. This tends to be not just a good change, but it tends to be a disruptive change, and we see backlashes, right, against it from people. One other point I want to emphasize is if you have all 4 of these and the 5th, it doesn't mean you inevitably are going to have genocide, right? I want to kind of bear that point in mind. Okay, 5th. We see in the 20th century something we've never seen before, and that is governments become very organized, and they become very effective at mobilizing their people to engage in public policy, right? So this is not like the French government deciding to go to war and 80% of the population of French peasants in the 1780s is basically ignorant of this, right? We're talking now about societies that are able to actually pull everyone in the population that is beyond simple childhood, 12, 13, 14 years old, and get them involved in the effort to achieve some goal. The picture I gave you is just about the United States during World War II. I'm not suggesting the United States was a genocidal power at that point. I don't mean that at all. But just to give you a sense, right, of the US effort, right? So we see this reference, this picture of a tank. It's the toughest Ford ever built because it's built in a Ford factory, literally. And the numbers of production here that you can just see that the United States manufactures are just extraordinary. I mean, 5,425 cargo ships. You sense Philadelphia Naval Yard, right? It's a big naval yard in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. It's not there anymore. But during World War II, it's literally building a ship a day. I mean, it's extraordinary. Think about that, right? Like a troop and cargo ship that's going to send material either to Europe to fight the Germans and the Italians, or to to the Pacific to fight against the Japanese. Societies are building putting together enormous amounts of effort to effectively get their populations to pursue some goal. And because in the genocides we see and it starts, by the way, even before World War I, but World War I is where we really see it start to emerge, right? The genocides that we see, and this often troubles people, right? In fact, you see a lot of people deny it. There are a lot of freaking perpetrators on the side of the genocidal state. There are a lot of people who participate. And that raises this question, right? Which in classes I teach, we spend a lot of time talking about. It's like, why do people participate? What gets them, right, to participate? Over here, you just quickly see some of the things, right, that governments in the 20th century and beyond use public effort, use the state to get people to try to achieve, right? So there's public works, there's buildings, the interstate highway system or the Autobahn, right? Public health efforts, everything from the eradication of smallpox and typhoid and typhus to now fighting a global pandemic, right? The government is like trying to kind of get people to participate in this. War is obviously the one that, is often seen in our minds as like the greatest generation fighting for the great cause, but then also we see in selected states, right, the crime of genocide. Have I got any questions at this point? Anything at all? Okay. We still have a few minutes, right? And still got some people hanging on to participate. And I just wanted to see if people would be willing to share some thoughts. There's no right answers right here. There's no wrong answers here. There's nothing I'm really specifically looking for. But rather, we think about the crime of genocide, right? We talk about victims, people who are targeted, perpetrators. Others might be rescuers, bystanders. That's actually a big group, people who do nothing, right? Bystanders. But then we also think about the question of community. And I've got a quote and I've got a theme, right? Both from the same book. Philip Garevich, who was a journalist for The New Yorker, 1999, wrote a very powerful, very disturbing book about the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide takes place in, again, 1994, takes place in less than 100 days. 800,000 people die, country of about 9 million at the time. Most of those people are Tutsis, right? And most of the perpetrators are Hutus, right? These are two groups that lived in Rwanda, often for a long time, without incident, without violence, but there's just this spasm of violence, right? The rate of killing exceeds the rate of killing during the Holocaust, right? And Garevich goes and, meaning the numbers of people killed each day, right? Garevich goes and he like wanders around Rwanda, like in the wake of this thing, trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? And the book that he has is, you can see the title, We Wish to Inform You Tomorrow We Will Be Killed Along with Our Families, Stories from Rwanda. The wish to inform you part, what he's doing is he's quoting a letter. There are about 1,000 Tutsis who are crammed into a church, and the leaders in that group are primarily Tutsi ministers, and they write a letter to the Hutu ministers in their community, right, Christian ministers, and they say, we're going to be killed tomorrow along with our families. Can you, like, in the spirit of Christian brotherhood, do something to help us? And their plea goes unanswered, and in fact, the Christian Hutu leaders stand outside urging the murderers to go in and butcher, again, about 1,000 people. Most of them, as was the case throughout Rwanda, are killed with machetes, right? These are not people who are killed in gas chambers or death marches or something like that, but they're killed very close combat, right? In this sort of horrific moment. So Garevich in that book has this very provocative and powerful quote, which I just lost. He says, quote, genocide, after all, is an exercise in community building. So my first question for the class is, the hell does he mean? How can genocide, how can murdering your neighbors create a community? And I can look for people who might want to talk. I can unmute you, or I might not be able to unmute you, but I'm happy to. Yeah, go ahead. So let's see if I can get you on here. I might not be able to. All right. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Go ahead, fire away.
Um, I kind of see it as I was actually having a discussion about this in my other class, kind of about like peer pressure.
Yep.
Um, and I just see that as I'm saying because everybody's like because if like the people who are involved like in the genocide they're doing it together and like I
Yep.
hate to say it is they're building kind of like a bond over the fact that they did that together. It's a terrible bond in my opinion, but
Yeah.
they're connected through that.
No, this is like a great answer, right? Again, it's like chilling and horrific to think about, right? But what we see them doing is saying, we're in this together. We're part of the same group, right? We're part of the same us. And then through the act of killing, we're identifying who, like what we would call the other is, right? So it's the we against them. There's a really, really chilling book about Rwanda. It's called Machete Season, right? Machete season. And what it is a series of interviews that a French journalist has with perpetrators. He goes to this prison where these guys are waiting to be tried. And he just sits and he talks to them like, what the hell were you doing and what were you thinking? He knows they're going to lie, but he has tactics to try to get some honest answers from them. And so you made a really important point that he emphasizes, right? Which is he says, there'd be a day where somebody would try not to go, right? Try not to go. The word they used was work, interestingly enough. Would try not to go to work, try to hide. And people would come and be like, hey, man, you're not dropping out on us. You're coming with us, right? Get your ass out there and help us like do this unpleasant business, but yet vital like work, right? We see similar things in the Nazi cases, where there are people who seem to say, um, yeah, there were people who tried to dodge their responsibility, but we were not going to let those bastards get away with their hands clean, right? And I think Shay, you're absolutely right, and I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm sorry if I don't, but
You're doing fine.
you can sort of see them using this as a way to like build group identity, right? So this is excellent. Good. I see somebody's got a question up here too. Let's see if I got that right. Good, right? So this is Dasha, and I don't know if everybody can see it, but it says, he means by getting rid of a target community, one can potentially create their own perfect community in their view, right? So what's really interesting and good about Dasha's point is this notion, right, that's out there that says, if we do this, we can make the world perfect. We can create utopia. And by eliminating the target community, we can bring in through violence a world that's pure, a world that's perfect, a world that's been transformed. And this idea sits out there in most of these genocides, right? There's this common theme of, yeah, like we can make the world a better place by getting rid of these people. In fact, we can purify the world. So this is excellent. Good. All right. Looks like Jacqueline, I've got to kind of shift back and forth with my glasses. Yeah, go ahead, John. Are you there, Jacqueline? Did I get you right? Hello? I think I can unmute you. I'm not really sure if I can. I'm going to try to do that. Go ahead. Let me see. Can you hear me, Jacqueline? I can't get you. It's also possible I don't know what I'm doing. All right. Others. Anybody else got a question? All right. So let's go back to this other quote he's got. Right, Gravich also makes this point where he says, this is not a quote, but this is me kind of paraphrasing what he says, right? He says, genocide is always ultimately about the destruction of the individual. What might he mean by this? How are we destroying individuals? Oh, this is a great question. So we'll go to another question. Tatiana's got a question. What are the steps to take to prevent a repetition of genocide? Right. This is right. Obviously, in some ways, in some ways, right. This is like the most urgent question. What's required? I mean, I think the first thing to note is the international community, the United States, has failed, right, to meet the challenge. Not just the United States, other countries as well. Since the UN Convention, right, passed in 1948, we've had genocide in Rwanda, we've had genocide in Cambodia, we've had genocide in, Bangladesh when Pakistan invaded it. And we can point to other examples, right? Cambodian genocide. And in all those instances, the genocide in Bosnia, right? Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, when that country falls apart in the 1990s. And Serbs, and to a lesser degree, Croats, kill 250, 300,000, right, of their, Bosnian people who had been their neighbors. Right? And in all those instances, foreign intervention is either non-existent or ultimately pretty limited. Right? And the question, what can be done, is this incredibly complicated one. So first, like, what do scholars think? So scholars will tell you, right? The first thing you have to be able to do is like identify this. You have to be able to know that it's happening. And therefore you have to be able to call the perpetrators, call the perpetrators murderers, right? And then what you have to try to do is mobilize the international community, but crucially, communities within states to be able to intervene. So I'll give you two examples. In Rwanda, the Clinton administration chooses not to intervene. They essentially choose to do nothing, right? And that's in 1994. And we sit on the sidelines. And again, 800,000 people die pretty quickly, in less than 100 days. The decision not to intervene was not unpopular. Americans were not pounding, saying, intervene, intervene, right? You see pictures today of people pounding on state houses saying, open up the economy. There was nothing on that. I mean, there are small numbers of people saying, we got to do something to protect these people who are suffering. But for the most part, that ultimately hasn't happened, right? Two other examples where you see some intervention. The United States, in fact, identifies the actions of the government of Sudan in the region in its west of Darfur, D-A-R-F-U-R, as committing genocide and urging the international community through the United Nations to take action. It is possible for governments not necessarily to send in troops, but to shut off money, to threaten leaders who are involved in this with persecution, to say to them, if you participate in this or if you don't stop this, you are ultimately going to be subject to persecution, right? And prosecution, forgive me. In fact, just 2 days ago, right, we saw somebody, a leader of the Rwandan genocide, was arrested in France, guy in his 80s, right? And told you'll be put on trial by the international community. We do know that in some cases that has served as a deterrent, but the real answer to Tatiana's question is that the international community so far has done a lot more talking about genocide successfully than intervening to prevent it. No real government is willing to put its full military force behind a policy that would shut it off, right? By the way, in Rwanda in 1994, there was a UN peacekeeping force on the ground when the genocide started. They were there, right? Thousands of UN soldiers. The United Nations voted with the urging of the United States crucial in this, not to increase the force, but to reduce the force dramatically down to a few hundred. So Tatiana, the short answer is the things that would be required: intervention, pressure, are things the international community has been reluctant to do. Not surprisingly, right? This is a pretty dark thing to study. And these conversations are sobering and depressing, unfortunately. For me, they're urgent for us to discuss and talk about, right? So that people can come to know about these crimes, the tragedies, the things that might have been done and could have been done. But the hope remains that someday in the future, the world will stand up and, do something more significant and more responsible. But the short answer is that we know what we can do to prevent it. The sad part is getting people, and by people, I don't just mean governmental leaders, I mean people within their own countries, to say, yes, this is a crime that we will not allow to happen. In 2008, when he was running for president, Senator John McCain said he regretted, right, that the United States did not intervene in Rwanda in 1994. And he made kind of an interesting argument that I think he was trying to put out there and say, this could be an argument for the future, where we would say, if we allow this to happen, something about the United States is diminished. The United States can't really be the United States in all the ways it's supposed to be without intervening when it can to stop such things. We should note also Presidents Obama and Trump both have limited the role of U.S. intervention overseas, but both in Iraq and in Syria, right, they bombed forces of people who were perpetrating crimes against innocent civilians, but not all of them. They much more often than not did nothing. But it's a great question. Other questions? Anything else from people? Oops, just can't help myself. I keep going off there. I guess I'll make two final quick points, right? The first, and certainly if people have questions, ask them. Oh, another question? No. Two quick points, right? Number one is about this question of the destruction of the individual, right? And, I think in some of the conversation that we've had already, right, particularly in response to Shay's question, we see some of this. Obviously, it's individuals who are targeted, and they're targeted not because of who they are individually, but because of the group that they're a member of. Right? Perpetrators themselves try to say, I'm not doing this as an individual angry about my neighbor. Often neighbors are killed by their neighbors. But I'm doing this as part of a group who is, as the one question said, is pursuing some kind of like utopian perfect world, right? We also know individuals try to hide their responsibility who committed the crimes, right? Sometimes because people are coming after them, but other times they just try to minimize what they did and try to essentially push responsibility off on somebody else. One last book reference I'll give you. There's a very, very powerful memoir. It's a thin book. It's called At the Mind's Limit. It's by a French author by the name of Jean Amery, A-M-E-R-Y. And Amery is persecuted as a Jew during World War II and is sent to Auschwitz. But a key theme in his book repeatedly is he says, like, I didn't think of myself as Jewish. I was not Jewish. I was myself, right? And in addition to all the crimes of murder the Nazis perpetrated, they perpetrated another crime, which is they didn't let me define who I am, right? And for Amery, that is one of the most sacred rights every individual, you and I included, have. This ability to like chart our own course in life, determining and announcing who we are, trying to bring ourselves to be the person that we want to be. And he says what the Nazis did was they said, we don't give a damn what you say, you're a Jew, right? And you're headed to Auschwitz. And that this was one of their many crimes, not the worst, he's not really in that business, but rather one of their many great crimes, right? So it's another book worth reading. So if you come to Flagler, choose to come to Flagler, I know most of you have made that choice already, but questions of war and violence and genocide are questions I engage in lots of the classes that I teach. There's a genocide seminar that I teach with Professor Young that I gave you the video link to right on C-SPAN. while hardly uplifting material, it is engaging and deep and important material. What I've also tried to give you a flavor for today is the ways in which I try, as many professors and faculty at Flagler do, to incorporate kind of conversation and move away from just simply presenting material, though that can obviously be essential, giving students the foundation that they need. But again, if you look at the video, you'll see a picture of this. But so I just, at the end, want to say thank you. I look forward, either as a professor or in my administrative role, to meeting and seeing all of you on campus, right, in the fall, and beginning the great conversations that can be so fundamentally transformative and meaningful for students. So again, thank you so much for coming out, and I hope you enjoy your day, and that your summers are rewarding, and that we're all together in the fall. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.